If there's one thing bigots can't stand, it's being held accountable for their hateful words and actions. To hear folks like Greg Koukl tell it, the worst kind of intolerance is when tolerant folks calls actual intolerance intolerant. And he gonna give us a good example of that today. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. And today we're going to tackle Chapter 7, which, like the previous 4 chapters, is all about what Greg calls the Columbo tactic. Up to now, Greg's been using the Columbo tactic to ask questions that conceal the believer's true Christian agenda. But today we're going to see Step 3, where the mask starts to slip a little. The third use of Columbo takes us more on the offensive, yet in an inoffensive way. We still use questions to keep our risk levels low and our comfort levels high. Here, though, since our queries have a different purpose, we ask a different kind of question, sometimes called a leading question. End quote. And of course, this is where the subterfuge starts to break down and the believer's hidden agenda starts to leak out. Quote, think of yourself like an archer shooting at a target. Your questions are your arrows. The point you want to make is the target you want to hit, and the target is key. If you're going to use questions to make a point, then you must be clear in your mind on what point you want to make. End quote. He goes on to explain that you want to pick different targets in different situations. Sometimes you'll ask questions Jeopardy-style. You'll have a particular point you want to make and you're just framing it in the form of a question. Other times you want to use questions to conversationally stack the deck in favor of some point or other that you're about to make. Or again, you might ask questions that stack the deck against some point you expect your opponent to try and make. The use of the right questions, says Greg, can be a clever way to, quote, enlist your opponent as an ally to help you build the case against his view, end quote. And notice that once again, Greg sees the person you're talking to not as your friend, but as your opponent. And he views the battle as one that must be won, not by fair combat, but by manipulation. Quote, in each of these situations, every time you ask a question and get a favorable response, your question accomplishes 2 things that a mere statement cannot. First, the person is telling you that he understands the point. Second, he's telling you he agrees with it, at least provisionally, and is taking a step forward with you in the thinking process. End quote. And this is a classic sales technique. You lead the customer gradually to the desired outcome in a way that convinces them that they's heading there voluntarily. You're talking them into doing something that might not be in their own best interest, but you're doing it in a way that makes them think it's their own idea. And now we come to the examples. And the first one's a softball exchange between Greg and a Christian he met while she was studying abroad in Germany. And she's having some issues with the idea that folks outside the church is doomed to hell, so he asks her a bunch of questions to remind her of all the things her Christian upbringing had taught her. This weren't really a case of Greg talking to somebody who disagreed with him. It's more like a tutor reviewing the student's material with them. So, not really much to say here. The second example, on the other hand, is a big one. Quote, I had a friend who was a deeply committed Christian woman whose boss was a lesbian. My friend had the maturity to know that you can't expect non-Christians to live like Christians. Her difficulty was that her boss wanted to know what she thought about homosexuality. That was awkward. End quote. Notice how Greg goes out of his way here to paint the boss as the aggressor and the Christian as the victim being forced into an awkward situation. He don't give us any specifics, but I'm going to go on ahead and press X to doubt here. In my experience, gay and lesbian folks typically don't go out of their way to solicit abuse from known or likely bigots. My suspicion is that this Christian lady was more likely itching to find some way to preach to her boss and tell her what a wicked sinner she really was. In my experience, that's typically how these situations work out. And I say that both as an employee who's had gay and Christian coworkers, and as a former Christian who's listened to other believers sharing their prayer requests about the situations they face at work. Greg's advice here is predictable. Quote, if you are placed in a situation in which you suspect your convictions will be labeled intolerant, bigoted, narrow-minded, or judgmental, use Columbo to turn the tables. End quote. And here's the questions that Greg thinks will turn the tables and make the boss look like she's actually the one who's being intolerant here. Quote, do you consider yourself a tolerant person or an intolerant person on issues like this? Is it safe to give my opinion, or are you going to judge me for my point of view? Do you respect diverse points of view, or do you condemn others for having convictions that differ from your own? End quote. And you can almost literally see the wounded Christian privilege dripping off these challenges like the tears of a poor, sweet, innocent child, can't you? The counter tactic here is crucially important because most folks gets it exactly wrong. There's a notion floating around called the paradox of tolerance, which says, while it sounds crazy to say so, you actually have to be intolerant of intolerance in order to be tolerance. Horse apples. I mean, technically that ain't false, but I can't think of a worse way to express it. It sows confusion and just gives bigots a pretext for hollering, see, you are intolerant. It's you that's the bigot for hating the word of God. No good ever comes of giving them an opening like that. If you's going to tread in that minefield without stepping on a mine, here's what you has to say. Tolerance is for people, not for things. Everybody's entitled to respect and tolerance by default just because they's people, because that's the foundational principle of a free and fair society. But it's important to remember that you can forfeit that right to respect and tolerance if you consistently behaves in harmful and antisocial ways. You's entitled to believe what you choose to believe, but a belief is a thing, not a person. People have a default right to tolerance and respect, and things don't. We generally respect each other's beliefs just out of courtesy and on account of the golden rule, but when beliefs and practices is antisocial and hurtful, they don't get to demand our respect and tolerance. Believe what you want in your own mind and live how you like in your own personal life, but if you's going to advocate malicious and antisocial dogmas, you can expect to be held accountable. If you don't want to be labeled a bigot, don't practice bigotry. It's that simple. Meanwhile, Greg's tactic here is as sneaky as it is dishonest. Quote, every person in every discussion is convinced that his own opinions are correct. He may not know they are correct, but he certainly believes they are. End quote. And what Greg's doing here is he's bringing up a tangential fact in order to change the subject. Yes, it's true that folks holds opinions because they believe those opinions is correct. That's universally true, but it's completely irrelevant to the topic of whether or not it's intolerant to condemn other folks just because they happens to fall in love differently than you do. He fleshes out this tactic with a hypothetical conversation. Quote, you're intolerant. Can you tell me what you mean by that? Why would you think I'm an intolerant person? Because it's clear you think you're right and everyone who disagrees with you is wrong. That's intolerant. End quote. Notice how carefully Greg has constructed this little conversation to make the definition of tolerance a matter of who agrees with whom. That ain't what tolerance is about. Tolerance is about treating other folks with respect and not subjecting them to harassment and abuse on account of them being different in some harmless way. But Greg is setting up a scenario in which the tolerant person is behaving like a hypocrite, which is a subtle ad hominem fallacy. It's sneaky and dishonest, but it's the key to Greg's tactics here, and it's leading up to his big gotcha at the end of his imaginary conversation. Quote, do you think your views are right? Yes, of course I think I'm right, but I'm not intolerant like you. That's the part that confuses me. Why is it that when I think I'm right, I'm intolerant, but when you think you're right, you're just right? End quote. And boom, the jaws of the trap spring shut, and the tolerant person is hoisted by their own petard. And Greg sits there with a smug little grin because he supposedly proved that they's being just as intolerant as he is. Well, the counter tactic here involves a few important points. Number one, avoid directly accusing the other person of being intolerant. Instead, focus on the behavior of the other person and point out how it's putting respect for things above respect for people. People is automatically entitled to respect and tolerance by default in a way that things like religious dogmas ain't. Folks is entitled to their own opinions, but that don't get them out of being held accountable for their words and action when they being hateful and antisocial. And by the way, not all speech is free speech, especially when it's abusive and hateful. Harassment, slander, terroristic threats, and lies is all forms of speech that ain't free and ought to be held to account. Number two, point out that it ain't a question of who's right, it's a question of what's right. Equal tolerance for all folks ain't right just because we says so. It's right because it's the foundation for a free and fair society. Everybody's different in some way, and it ain't right to exploit harmless differences in order to deny folks their right to equal respect and fair treatment. Golden rule again. We tolerate differences in other folks because we's different too, and we wouldn't want other folks using our differences as a pretext for harassing us and denying us our fundamental human rights. Number three, point out that it's possible for folks to forfeit their right to equal respect if and they persistently behaves in ways that's abusive and antisocial. One of the trade-offs of participation in a free and fair society is that we has to acknowledge our responsibility to behave like civilized adults. And that means putting limits on how far we go in expressing disapproval of differences we personally don't like. My right to swing my fist freely ends at the tip of your nose. If you wants to hold primitive religious prejudices against other folks as part of your personal freedom of religion, okay, you has a right to swing your fist, but that right stops at the point where you start to have an impact on other folks' rights, including the right to equal respect and equal protection under the law. If you refuse to respect that limit on your own freedom, you forfeit your own right to be respected, and you deserve to be held accountable for your antisocial attitudes and actions. That ain't us being intolerant, that's you acting badly and suffering the appropriate consequence. So no, we ain't being hypocrites when we criticize the bad behavior of others. Tolerance is for people, not for things. If you's going to insist on behaving in ways that's harmful to others, you's working hard to earn our disrespect, and you got no grounds to complain when you get it. Moving on, in the next part of Chapter 7, Greg's next tactic is one that he calls exploiting a weakness or flaw. And this time he uses the example of a college student making creationist talking points to try and disrupt a biology class. And if y'all will bear with me, I'm going to skip over that one on account of creationism is a whole nother rabbit hole in and of itself. Suffice it to say that the quote-unquote flaws that Greg thinks he's finding ain't really the flaws he thinks they is. His second example under this heading, though, is a classic case of using a straw man to reverse a burden of proof inappropriately. And it's all about a professor who don't believe in the Bible. Quote, suppose he answered, I know the Bible is a myth because it has miracles in it. A common line of thinking for materialists. This bit of valuable information sets up the next series of questions. Student, how do you know miracles don't happen? Professor, because science has shown that miracles don't happen. End quote. According to Greg, the controversial claim here is the claim that science has shown that miracles don't happen. But that's a straw man because that ain't what science says about miracles. The real controversial claim here is the claim that miracles do happen. That's a positive claim that requires a burden of proof, but Greg can't meet that burden and he knows it. So he puts up a straw man to reverse the burden. And he thinks he's successfully defended himself here because science can't prove that miracles don't happen. Quote, science has never advanced any empirical evidence to show that supernatural events cannot happen. Instead, according to the dictates of naturalistic philosophy, science has assumed a priori, prior to looking at the evidence, that miracles are impossible. End quote. And no. At most, what science has done is to assign the burden of proof to the side that's making the controversial claim, i.e., that miracles happen. That is the correct approach, and if it turns out that this approach puts biblical miracles at a disadvantage, that ain't science's fault. That's on the Bible. Science deals exclusively with what can be reliably and verifiably determined to be consistent with objective reality, and as such it has no a priori position either for or against the supernatural, nor does it have any prior prejudice in favor of the natural, despite what a lot of well-meaning skeptics may say. It ain't a question of natural versus supernatural. It's exclusively a question of what can be reliably and verifiably shown to be consistent with objective reality and what can't. If something supernatural is objectively real, then it's subject to scientific inquiry, supernatural or not. The problem lies in the definition of supernatural. The supernatural is defined as that which is distinct from the natural, but natural in this instance is defined as what's distinct from the supernatural. It's a circular definition that don't tell us nothing. The whole natural versus supernatural dichotomy is based on the assumption that there exists some independent realm outside of the natural world such that we can divide all real things into things that's natural and things that's supernatural. And that's circular reasoning. As soon as you use the term supernatural as if it was a meaningful term, you've already presupposed the real existence of the supernatural. What's more, the same thing is true if you use the term natural as if it meant something distinct from the supernatural. By accusing scientists of having a naturalistic bias, Greg is implicitly assuming the real existence of the supernatural so that the natural can be defined as not supernatural. And that's circular reasoning. It's a bit subtle, but it's inescapable. The only way to avoid the circular reasoning here is to acknowledge that science don't deal with quote-unquote non-supernatural phenomena. Science only deals with objectively verifiable phenomena. And that means when you say something is quote-unquote supernatural and is therefore outside the domain of science, what you're really saying is that the supernatural can't be reliably and verifiably determined to be consistent with reality. And that's a problem. If something can't be verifiably determined to be consistent with reality, then the best you can say about it is that it's hearsay. When you say that you believe in the supernatural, you saying that you believe stuff just because someone told you, even though you know it ain't reliable and verifiable. Because if it was reliable and verifiable, you wouldn't have called it supernatural. And believing stuff just because someone said so, knowing that it ain't reliable and verifiable, is just plain old-fashioned gullibility. You can call it faith if you like, but in practical terms, it's gullibility. You's believing what you've been told just because someone said so. In the next section, Greg tells a long story about how he witnessed to a Jewish feller and used his Columbo tactic, including all the leading questions, in order to present his case. It's also kind of a rabbit hole, and there ain't much new in there, so I was going to skip over this one too. But he follows that up with a much shorter example, and that one is worth a look. His goal is to try and prove that God is the only explanation for the supposed existence of objective morality. And here's his list of questions. Quote, do you believe there is real evil in the world? Is the evil you described objective evil, or just things that happen that don't fit your fancy? Do you think some kind of standard is necessary for you to distinguish good from evil, right from wrong? That standard, then, can't be inside us, relativism, but must be outside us, objectivism. Where do you think that objective moral standard comes from? End quote. Obviously, this ain't curiosity. This is a full-blown argument being presented, Jeopardy-style, in the form of questions. And the thing to do here is to nip this one right in the bud right from the very first question. Is there real evil in the world? Well, of course, that depends on what you mean by real evil. There's objective, material consequences for things, and some of those consequences causes folks to subjectively suffer. And you might call that, quote-unquote, real evil, but there's more to it than that. Morality is what happens when we try and maximize our positive social interactions and minimize the negative ones. And since our actions can have objective, material consequences for other folks is going to have opinions about our behavior. And some of those opinions is going to provoke folks to treat us in ways that we don't like. And this is predictable. When we do stuff like stealing or killing, that's going to have predictable material consequences for other folks, and they's going to get mad and take it out on us. So we calls it bad or wrong or evil to do stuff like killing and stealing, because we know it's going to come back and bite us. It ain't something that's personally subjective, because it depends on the reactions of society in general and not just my personal subjective opinions. But on the other hand, it ain't something that's purely objective neither, because it's driven by folks' subjective reactions to our behavior. It's a social consensus that emerges from individuals trying to maximize their positive social interactions. And of course, Greg's going to bring up the Nazis and say, well, what's to stop a society from turning to fascism and persecuting immigrants and other minorities cruelly and unfairly? To which I reply, look around you. That's exactly what is happening in American society right now, with something like 80% evangelical support, according to some exit polls. And he'll say, well then, on what basis do you claim that there's anything morally wrong with that? And I'm going to say, the material consequences of those actions. Folks don't just judge you on your behavior, they judge you on your response to the suffering of others. And if in your response to the real persecution of immigrants and women and LGBT folks is to holler, "Make America great again," you're going to get canceled, and future generations of believers is going to remember you as not a true Christian, just like everybody else who's ever subverted their faith in the service of tyrants. Social consensus may not be divinely omnipotent, but over the long term, it's got more power than any mere religion, as witnessed by the decline and rejection of biblically sanctioned slavery and sex trafficking. And history is going to repeat itself yet again. And at this point, I think I was going to put a bookmark in and pick up the rest of Chapter 7 next time. I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that about wraps it up for me for today. Next time, we'll pick up where we left off and look at some more of the sample gotcha questions that Greg suggests to his readers. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.